Hi everyone, and welcome back from our lunch break. Hopefully everyone got a chance to get a stretch, get some food, maybe even visit some of our sponsors in the exhibitor booths. Thanks everyone. I'm just seeing people trickle in, so I'll just give everyone a little bit of time. But I'll give a little intro to this session. So for this session, we have one presentation and our two speakers here. This is management efforts in urban centers, so from a bit of a different perspective. So really great to welcome Clara Greig from the City of Toronto and Chris Cormack from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority to talk about it from this perspective. And I think I'll pass it over to both of you to get us started. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabby. Just really quickly, can you see everything all right? I'm
Yes,
sure.
it looks great. Yes,
Perfect.
thanks.
Well, as Gabby said, my name is Clara Greig, and I'm a natural resource specialist with the City of Toronto.
And I'm Chris Cormack. I'm a project manager with Toronto Region Conservation Authority.
Okay. So I just wanted to start off today's presentation with thanking Janice and her team, especially Emily and Gabby, for organizing such a wonderful conference today. Janice very kindly asked Chris and me to present today about our Phragmites removal project that the city and TRCA have been working on together in Grenadier Pond in High Park. So for the presentation today, we will provide you with just a quick overview of this project, including the process we followed to develop an integrated pest management plan, our implementation, our on-site operations, some of our challenges, and our next steps. So to start, Toronto's natural heritage system covers approximately 17% of Toronto's land area, and it's protected under the Ravine and Natural Feature Protection Bylaw. Within this area, there are 86 environmentally significant areas, and the city and the TRCA have an agreement that allows the city to manage TRCA-owned land. So we'll often work together on invasive species management, plantings, wetland restoration, and other natural area infrastructure improvement in these ESAs and other areas of the natural heritage system. And so together we've been managing Phragmites citywide for many years now, but most recently in September 2024, the city and the TRCA have started the Grenadier Pond Phragmites removal project. So just a quick overview of Grenadier Pond. It is located in High Park, which is in the west end of Toronto. High Park is 161 hectares in size, and it's in a very urbanized area. It's basically an island. So despite it being an island, it's highly biodiverse. There are over 300 native naturally occurring flora species and over 60 fauna species found throughout the park. And the park as a whole, including Grenadier Pond, is designated as an area of natural and scientific interest, an environmentally significant area. And in 2022, Grenadier Pond was designated as a provincially significant wetland complex. So as you can imagine, being in such an urban environment, the hydrology has been altered tremendously, and Grenadier Pond is actually a stormwater management pond. And then on top of all of this, there is a very prolific Phragmites population, which first began to establish in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it's now approximately 2.7 hectares in size. So this time series to the right, sorry, my screen's to the right, it shows the progress of the population since 2005. So we can see that patch, it begins to proliferate, and now it's basically a dense monoculture, which is what we were dealing with. And so because Grenadier Pond and High Park are so ecologically rich, and it's also one of the city's greatest urban green spaces, there is a tremendous amount of community interest, and people love this park and really strive to ensure the park is properly cared for. And High Park also holds great significance to First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and many other First Nations, Inuit and Métis people that now call Toronto home. Uh-oh. Sorry. Disaster. Oh no. There we go. Okay. So there was actually initial Phragmites management in 2018, but this was limited to the terrestrial population just because at the time there were no pesticides available for overwater use. And then actually after the initial treatment, there was quite a bit of community pushback about the work because of concerns of pesticides. And a lot of these community members were Indigenous peoples from the surrounding community. So we began discussions to address these concerns, but then we simultaneously kind of entered the pandemic. So the project was really put on pause. But this led to a very important lesson for us, and this is the need to build meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples and include Indigenous-led stewardship groups throughout the planning process. So this is a key lesson, and we were able to carry this forward to the current project, which I'll describe in later slides. And this project also initiated a really important relationship between the city and the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle, and ILSC for short. It's a circle of elders, knowledge keepers, and community members that are committed to healing Indigenous lands and communities in Toronto. But in terms of the 2018 treatment, we did see success in areas where herbicide was applied. So the top photo, we see the Phragmites right near the fence line. And then in the bottom photo, we can see it's been set back and all you have is the aquatic population in the background. And then we have our native vegetation that has reestablished. Okay, there we go, good. So given this high ecological and social complexity of High Park, our four main priorities to shape our integrated pest management plan included community engagement, protecting species at risk, and native vegetation and wildlife. We wanted to use a variety of tools available for managing Phragmites so as to limit our pesticide use, and we also wanted to set ourselves up for long-term management capacity. So we created a working group, and this consisted of the City of Toronto, the TRCA, Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle, Turtle Protectors, Lynn Short, and the Invasive Phragmites Control Center. And so the Turtle Protectors, they're actually another Indigenous-led community group that have, we've also had the opportunity to build a relationship, and they're really integral in providing us information about turtle populations in Grenadier Pond, as well as other wildlife observations throughout the project. So as a group, we met twice virtually to hold open discussions about the use of pesticides, as there was still many concerns. And as a group, we went to Tommy Thompson Park to look at Phragmites population that had been significantly reduced using pesticides and was now mainly being managed with manual techniques. And so as we met, an overarching goal for the project emerged, and this was significantly to reduce the extent of the Phragmites population of Grenadier Pond over the 2-year period using integrated pest management, and then to allow shoreline and wetland restoration with native plant communities to improve the overall health of the pond. And this would also improve habitat for turtles and wildlife. And so we had these conversations, but it is just very important to acknowledge that Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle and Turtle Protectors, they do not support pesticide use, but they recognize that Grenadier Pond is unwell and they want to be part of this restoration effort. So on top of our working group, we also had a communications plan for community engagement. I have a table here that breaks down our targeted audience as well as the different materials we created. So we notify the counselor's office whenever we carry out major projects. So for the counselor, we provided a briefing note, a Q&A, and a pesticide use notification. For general public inquiries, we added a section on Phragmites management to our city webpage and also updated the 311 knowledge base with specific details about the project. For our volunteer stewardship engagement, we developed a volunteer spading program with the support of Lynn Short, and we held 6 spading events, and we also hosted a tour during the actual treatment window. For ILSC and Turtle Protectors, we held our working group meetings, as I previously mentioned. We also submitted a Eco Action grant to get more funding for volunteer engagement. Unfortunately, it was not successful, but it was still really great to be able to work with the Turtle Protectors on that. And then the day before treatment occurred, ILSC held ceremony for Grenadier Pond's waters and offered SEMA to the land to give thanks to Phragmites before removal. For community engagement, I regularly attended community meetings of an environmentally focused community group and provided email updates to other groups operating within High Park. For passive park users, we posted project notice signs. We also attached Phragmites fact sheets to posted pesticide signs. And then while we were doing the actual treatments, TRCA staff and city staff were on the ground answering any questions. There was also homeowner outreach, which occurred. There's about 42 homes that back onto the pond. So we flyered these homes 3 times and went door to door, knocking, trying to communicate the project, as some people have Phragmites on their land. So next is Chris. Go.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk more about the operations and the actual work that was done on site. So in terms of initial steps, we started off with vegetation monitoring, and we did that with our biology team that came in and set up a few transects across the stations of the Phragmites so that we can compare as the treatments and the work progresses from year on year to show how much change is occurring, not just in the reduction of the Phragmites itself, but also in the recolonization by native species coming into that wetland area. So that monitoring will be continued on an annual basis for the next several years. We did go through and look at all the different treatment methods, following best management practices, and it was determined that we needed to use both chemical intervention as well as manual. So the goal would be to cut as much of the Phragmites underwater using truck saws as possible, and then treat the remaining areas with chemical product. As well as Clara noted, there's a large community group that has been engaged to do the spading as part of the program. Next slide, please. In terms of implementation, as Clara noted, there's a lot of private homes. As you can see on that map on the right, all of the orange boundary lines are private land. The little blue and green spots, if you can see those are the Phragmites patches along the private lands that are along that side of the pond. Now, because those are private lands, we couldn't treat on those private properties without having access agreements with individual landowners. So that provided a bit of a challenge for the first year that will be continued on moving into treatments within this 2025 season, trying to reach those individual property owners and being able to coordinate access agreements so that those pieces of land can be treated as well. Some other things that we came across that was quite difficult for a project like this is just being able to access with larger equipment. The truckers are not huge, but access to this pond is fairly limited. It did require a lot of coordination between a large number of staff to be able to partially close trails just to access the equipment and being able to get the equipment into the water. And in terms of the actual use of herbicides in the pond, as Clara noted, there's a lot of coordination, community involvement, trying to describe the plan and get everyone on board. Because we were also using Habitat Aqua along the margins of the pond, it did require specific Habitat Aqua permitting, which also included notifications to all of the property owners as well as park users around the area. Next slide. So as we noted, there's a 3-pronged approach, and that's underwater cutting using the truck saw, as well as using a Habitat Aqua treatment along the shorelines where the truck saw couldn't access because of water depth or obstructions. As is known, the imazapyr in Habitat Aqua is very effective at treating the Phragmites without affecting the aquatic population, but it also can affect trees. And there is a fairly substantial tree population along the shore in areas of the pond. So those areas needed to be avoided so that there was no spraying done anywhere under the canopy of those trees. Those areas would have to be then targeted as manual removal. So those are some of the targets that will be used for the community groups doing spading. And then glyphosate was used in the terrestrial areas. So away from the actual shoreline in the dry portions, the glyphosate was able to be used, and that is still safe to be using under most of the tree canopy that's there. On the left there, you can see where the pile was. So the truck sorters were grabbing it all, piling it up, and putting that into an area where buckthorn management had early been done by a community group. So it was an area that was high and dry and will just be allowed there to then degrade and hopefully also smother the buckthorn from coming back. So a few things that we learned on site, and this is things that happened just throughout the year. One of them was that the water level does fluctuate quite rapidly within Grenadier Pond because it is a water management pond. The water level was a lot lower than we had expected once we got the truck sorters in to do the work, which meant there was a lot less area that could actually be cut with the truck sorter with the lower water level, which was unfortunate because we were hoping to be able to cut a good proportion of it and ended up meaning that larger quantity of herbicide was required to still target the same amount of area. Another obstacle we came across was literally obstacles within the large frag patch to the north end where there's a lot of down woody debris. And that prevented access with the truck sorter. So the map in the very center there, you can see the patch in the middle. The red area was able to be treated, but the center was inaccessible with the truck sorter for this year. So manual treatment was done. You can see the bottom left there along the perimeters of that section. But with that stand being so established, it wasn't really accessible to the middle for this year. You can see on that top right photo how large some of the rhizomes were, and that just shows how well that stand has been established over time. Next slide. So moving forward into this year, there is going to be some cutting of the treated Phragmites over the winter by staff, including potentially some access areas just to make it easier to treat that northern section. We will continue with vegetation monitoring as noted, with the biology team going in and doing their fixed transects to compare treatments over the last few years, as well as updating our mapping to see where the boundaries of the Phragmites will be for this year.
Thanks, Chris.
And back to you, Clara.
Thank you. So just circling back to our community engagement component, I just wanted to discuss a few lessons learned. So first, building relationships with ILSC and turtle protectors since 2018 was very critical. Had we not spent these past 6 years building this relationship, this work really would not have been possible. Similarly, it was really important to establish a working group and meet regularly to make sure everyone's voices were being heard and concerns were being discussed. And this project was really a long time coming. We had many members of the public that really supported this work and pushed for this work, but we also received pushback from some community members regarding pesticide use as well as mechanical removal operations. But any project, like we've discussed in previous presentations, there's always going to be pushback. So it's just important to try to embrace these challenging conversations and try to appreciate where concerns are coming from. And then one key lesson for me was to have an established timeline and communications plan, and then just try to stick to that timeline as best I could. You always fall behind, but it's good to have something to strive for. And then in terms of next steps for our community engagement, our spading program was really wonderful and highly successful. My wonderful colleague, Chris Borowski, worked closely with Lynn Short to lead this program. So we'll definitely continue with this. It was key for community engagement and education, and really will be critical in the long-term management of Phragmites, as we're hoping we can use manual techniques once the population's been significantly reduced. Another really big goal for us is to work with ILSC as well as Lynn Short to hold Phragmites spading events for Indigenous youth to get them out and on the land. And yeah, we tried to make it happen this year, but just timing was tight and we couldn't get it together in time. And then, as Chris mentioned, continued homeowner outreach. I'm working with legal, trying to figure out if we can get temporary access agreements to treat Phragmites on private property. So hopefully we'll figure that out for 2025. And then finally, our future restoration. So we're looking forward to seeing the results from this year's treatment. We'll do treatment again in 2025, and then in a perfect world, we'll see great reduction in Phragmites, hopefully up to 95%. And then again, hopefully we see native seed bank reestablishment. And it would be even more awesome if we could also establish a biocontrol population once the population's been significantly reduced, but only time will tell. But hearing all these presentations earlier really gives me a lot of excitement and hope for our project as well. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who's been involved with this project. It's been an amazing group. My colleagues at TRCA and the city, Invasive Phragmites Control Center, ILSC, Turtle Protectors, Lynn Short, Dana Lynn Williams, Dr. Rebecca Rooney, Dr. Ian Jones, and Dr. Michael McTavish for answering all my questions about biocontrol. None of this work would be possible without you all, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clara and Chris. Really great presentation. I think it really highlighted just the collaboration that can happen at all levels. One really quick question for you before we move on to the next speaker. Just wondering with that, talking with the public, engaging with the public, those private landowners, was there a particular knowledge gap that was identified that, something that we can work on to forward communications about Phragmites to kind of get people to be aware of the work going on and why it's beneficial? Was there anything that kind of came out that was specific that people kind of struggled to be okay with?
It's a great question. I think probably the biggest gap is pesticide use and understanding that there is in situations when you're using BMPs and licensed staff, it can be used in a safe and effective manner, and it can be used and then have follow-up manual removal. So communicating that and kind of like what Janice has said and these other presentations have shown, it's like the proof is in the pudding. So I think after a year of doing this work and they see the great results, then we'll have definitely more buy-in. But that's the main gap at this time, just pesticide use. So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Great. All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation. We really appreciate hearing that perspective, and I think we'll move on to our next one. Thanks so much, Clara and Chris.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
And I will just note we did have one question. Perhaps we can, if Vicky or Emily could put that in the chat. Clara and Chris, if you don't mind just answering that in the chat, I think that would be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, for our next session, we have our panel, another panel, our Indigenous Leadership on Invasive Phragmites. And I'm going to pass it over to Teresa Vincentini, Community Science Coordinator and GIS Lead with the Invasive Species Center, to moderate our panel. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you, Gabby. I actually have recently moved into a new role, and I forgot to mention that to Gabby, but I am now the Northern Regional Coordinator, Northern Ontario Regional Coordinator for the Ontario Phragmites Action Program with the ISC as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.
I want to extend a chimiigwech to Gabby and Janice for inviting me to moderate this session on Indigenous leadership on invasive Phragmites. I'm very excited and eager to listen in on this session, which will highlight Indigenous leadership and collaborative efforts and unique perspectives in safeguarding habitats and communities for the ecological impacts of Phragmites. Just a little bit on the formatting of this session. It is a panel, as was mentioned. So we'll begin with having each panelist introduce themselves and their connection to Indigenous communities and invasive Phragmites. And then this will be followed by a longer Q&A discussion period. So please feel free as audience members to submit your questions to the Q&A box throughout the presentations and identify which panelist your question is for if it is specific for one panelist. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the panelists. So I believe if all of you have your cameras on already, that's great. Maybe if you can just say a quick hello so that you're kind of center of the screen after I introduce you. Many of you know Dana Lynn Williams, founder and executive director of the First Nations Phragmites Control from Anjanaw First Nation. If you can just say hello, Dana Lynn.
Hello, everyone.
Awesome. We also have Lynn Short joining us from Toronto area, who is a retired environmental stewardship specialist at Humber College.
Hello there.
Awesome. And joining us from the other side of the Great Lakes is Travis Bartnick from a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission from Wisconsin.
Hello, everyone.
And then lastly, we also have Curtis Avery joining us, a member of and manager of environment for Nipissing First Nation.
Miigwech. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here.
Awesome. All right, Miigwech for introducing yourselves, and Gabby, if you can share the presentations, and we'll start off with Dana Lynn to kind of get further into where she's from and what her connections to Phragmites.
Okay. Bonjour, Ani, Sagolis Kanagoga Hojawa, and Kalamasi. Everyone, my name is Dana Lynn Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of the First Nation Phragmite Control, a unique nonprofit First Nation-run business. I'm an Ojibwe Delaware from the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and my roots run deep as I'm also from Moravian Town. That was my mother's territory. I've had the privilege of living and being raised on Wapul Island, Oneida, Chippewa of the Thames, and over the years, I've worked on different territories across the north. Two of those were fly-in communities. I've had the honor of working with elders and youth, and I truly love all my relatives. While working with Aamjiwnaang First Nation Environmental Department, I attended an event at Chatham where I was deeply moved by a presentation from Dr. Janice Gilbert. She discussed an invasive plant called Phragmites, which was rapidly overtaking our waterways. Our team at Aamjiwnaang tried to find someone to assist with the Phragmite problem at a small pond on our territory, but securing funding and locating the right support proved to be nearly impossible. I reached out to Dr. Janice Gilbert and explained my plans about starting up a business to help the various communities with the invasive plant, something I had been considering for a few years. I registered the organization as a nonprofit and began taking the necessary steps to get things underway. At the time, I had no idea what challenges and experiences the coming years would bring. So in starting that, with our first slide, bringing awareness and engaging with leaders in the communities was a large step. Having an incredible mentor and support, of course, Dr. Gilbert, and always following the living by our teachings as First Nations persons. You can change the slide. This is just a concept of the logo and how I put it together. And I don't want to get into all of that because it will take up much of the time for the presentation, but next slide. Our First Nation communities, fishing and hunting have long been central to our life on the territories, but now addiction has become widespread and pervasive. And I'm not saying that it's because, well, I am saying it's because of this plant, because it's taking away from who we are. It's a time to reconnect with our youth, with our lifestyle, and deeply rooted in our heritage. But there's a challenge standing in the way, an invasive plant known as a Phragmites. Phragmites are obstructed our way of life and persist in overtaking the landscape, creating a suffocating, oppressive grip that severely is damaging and undermining our traditional way of life. Next slide, please. So what we do is we bring understanding to the different territories across, of course, Ontario right now. And we work with the elders and the youth. We engage with the communities and make them aware of Phragmite issues. And we build the trust and understanding of what the work we're going to be doing. Next slide, please. When I talked to you about choosing a mentor, my choice was very easy. It was Dr. Gilbert. Why did I choose this person in the organization? It was because of a deep sense of respect, honesty, humility, bravery, wisdom, truth, love. They demonstrated a genuine willingness to listen, learn, and understand our way of life. And this has been really helpful. I know that we share a common goal and love for the land, particularly in restoring the wetlands, which are the lifeblood of the earth, bringing harmony to our Mother Earth, Turtle Island. Next slide, please. So learning occurs by combining culture and science. And so this is something that we've kind of merging both to support and benefit the community. Many First Nation organizations are overlooked and disregarded because the groups seeking access to these territories often believe they know best. dismissing the expertise and the efforts of the First Nation organizations that initially welcome them. Next slide, please. Now, as I explained to you in the beginning, I'm part of the Haudenosaunee as well. I'm a Anishinaabe, but we follow the principles of the two-row wampum, which teaches us to stay in our own paths, never crossing over and interfering with each other, but instead learning from one another and working towards a common goal of creating a better future for the next generations. This teaching comes from the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee way of life. Next slide, please. So we've had the opportunity to work with these territories. We're doing demonstration sites with Wapwell Island, Aamjiwnaang, Kettle and Stony Point, Chippewas of the Thames, Alderville, Curve Lake. We're going to be working into Oneida, Muncie, Moraviantown, and the list just goes on across Ontario. Next slide, please. What we do when we go in, we inform the communities what we're doing, and through social media, newsletters, anything that we can provide, we want to make sure that the community knows that eradication efforts are coming. We explain to them who approved it, usually the chief and council or the environmental departments. We go on to explain that we have qualified individuals who have all of their certificates and that are coming in to do the work. And so this just explains what's going to take place. Next slide, please. Once we do the demonstration sites, in which we've done on Wapwell Island, Aamjiwnaang, and Kettle and Stony Point, these signs are going to be the size of 5x7 piece of plywood, and they're going to go up in the area where the work was done, so they can see what it looked like before and what it's going to look like in the future. Well, they'll see what it's looking like because we've done the work. Next slide, please. We've had to do some warnings about on the territories because unfortunately during the spring a number of fires had been started in one community, and so we had to kind of bring awareness to that. And again, that was done through the community, and it was approved by the leaders on that and those territories. Next slide, please. So what does the future look like? That we have educated and worked with a number of the First Nation communities in Ontario. A plan has been developed to help equip the territories with the necessary resources to address future eradication efforts through their works, lands resources, and environmental departments. So we're setting up different things like coloring books, workbooks for the works departments to go back and take a look so that the environmental and works departments are working together. And we always were having an open understanding that we'll be able to assist them if they need any help once the individuals are trained to go in to do the work. Next slide, please. And I want to thank you. So Yoko, Miigwech, and Wawanisi. I want to thank you for allowing me to do this presentation, and thank you for taking the time to listen.
Yoko.
Thank you, Dana Lynn.
Yes.
I really like the connections that you've brought in between different areas of, challenges, but also strengths. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to Lynn Short and her introduction.
Hi there. Thank you, Dana Lynn. I didn't realize the extent of your project until today, so I really appreciated listening to your presentation. So my dad is part of Ojibwe, but I'm very mixed heritage. I have also Irish, Scottish, German, and English from all of my ancestors. And so I didn't grow up with that heritage until I came to Humber and got the opportunity to study under Onabonese, who is an elder who was teaching Indigenous knowledge courses. And then after I took all of his courses, the elder in residence, Shelley Charles, asked me if I would be his Ashkabewitz, his helper. And so I spent 4 years working with him, and we continue our relationship. Although he's retired, we continue our relationship outside the college. So a lot of the teachings that I bring are from him. So next slide, please. I just wanted to get you, a little bit on track. Where Phragmites started for me was Wimblewood Beach, which is where my husband's family has had property on Georgian Bay for already 4 generations. And the when the water level went down, then the Phragmites started to colonize the beach. And so the water level on Georgian Bay goes up and down all the time, but once the level was down, the Phragmites started to really colonize. So the picture on the right is my husband in an area that is now no longer doesn't have Phragmites anymore, but that was and then the picture on the left, I wanted to show that because other people have mentioned the extent of the biomass under the ground. So this was a real eye-opener for a lot of the residents on the beach, because when the water level started to come up and started to erode the sand away, it exposed that tangle of rhizomes, and people prior to that had no idea. When I was talking, they would say to me, well, why don't you just dig it out? And so anyway, I just thought that was an interesting photo to show the growth above and the rhizomes below. Next slide, please. So I thought, because plants and the animals are all our relatives, regarded as our relatives from an Indigenous perspective, I thought the most appropriate thing to start controlling Phragmites, because it didn't come here voluntarily. It was brought here accidentally, but it didn't belong there. And as I said, Onabanase always told me that because the plants and the animals are other relatives, they have so many gifts, but they don't have the gifts of speech, and we do. So that makes it our responsibility to try to speak for the animals and the plants. So I thought, okay, this plant is taking over the beach. How am I going to try to control it? And decided that I would just think like a plant. So photosynthesis is the thing that produces the energy in the form of the sugar that it makes. And so if we could stop photosynthesis, then that would mean that we could compromise the plant's ability to keep growing. And so that was the approach I took. So next slide, please. So I thought, and I also teach in horticulture, or I did, I just retired, I'm still getting used to that. Anyway, I teach in horticulture at Humber College. So I got out my horticulture tools. And because we sharpen all our tools, automatically I would sharpen the spades. So we decided that if I cut the stalk below the surface of the soil, then it couldn't photosynthesize. And if I kept doing that, then I could weaken that underground structure. So that was my approach. And I thought it was accessible to really anybody who had a spade. Although at the beginning, when I asked people if they had a spade, they showed me a round mouth shovel. So I had to also teach them about that too. But next slide, please. So the thing about Phragmites is it doesn't go away very easily. It also is well established, and of course it has lots of survival strategies as well. So manually controlling it has to be a long-term effort, and involving lots of people. And so, because at the time that I started, we didn't have any chemicals that were approved over the water, and we were working right at the edge of the water. And I felt that the best way to deal with the plant was to do it in a manual way. And that allowed the community members to get really up close and personal with not only that plant, but the plants that began to colonize the beach, the native plants that came back and the native animals that came back. And it really, if you can establish a sense of community with a purpose, then that encourages long-term involvement. And the results were really rewarding. So next slide, please. So I also, at the beginning, the properties along the beach are privately owned. So sometimes the owners were willing to work on the beach, but some of them didn't have time or energy, but they understood the problem with Phragmites, because particularly some of them couldn't even see their beach for the Phragmites. It was too thick. So we just decided, well, there's a lot of teenagers on the beach. and they have lots of energy, and for so that residents were willing to pay them by the hour, or they could also choose to do their community service, but most of them chose to be paid. So they would work with me from 8 in the morning till 11, which was before high noon, and remove the Phragmites selectively. And then you can see some of the students on the right are bagging it so that it didn't go anywhere once it was removed. And they learned so much. They were able to connect with the land. It connected them back to the land where they hadn't really been paying attention before. So next slide, please. And it's really the smiles on the faces. Actually, the picture on the right is one of the volunteers at the Grenadier Pond at High Park. And he was pulling out some of the Phragmites right from the edge of the water, and look at the smile on his face. He was just, I even have had, some of the kids and some of the adults that work with me saying, I'll say it's 11 o'clock, we have to stop. And they'll say, oh, but just one more, or just a little bit more, or just let me finish this area. So, I think that the concern for the land develops as you interact with the plants and the animals on the land. And I think that's so important, because it is really our responsibility to, one of the elders I work with is Elder Albert Marshall from Mi'kmaq territory. And he always says, nature has rights and we have responsibilities. And so next slide, please. So there's also, and I didn't know at the time when I was preparing this that we would be talking a lot about cut to drown. So I've also used that manual method to control aquatic growth, because I did try with my spade, but I learned, this is just a physics thing, but when you put the spade in the water, the buoyancy effect makes the spade just not as powerful to kick as it is on land. So we had to look for a better method, and we used the cane cutters. And actually somebody that I worked with, we call it, what does he call it? I think he calls it the frag fighter. He made me a tool before I started using Robert in the city of Toronto, one of the volunteer groups I worked with. He made this tool. His brother was a blacksmith, so he made a tool that he gave to me to cut under the water. So next slide, please. And these are some of, this is at Humber College. We have a pond. We have some ponds at Humber College. And I was working with students at the college, and they were in the water with their chest waders and removing the Phragmites from the bottom of the pond. And we had a few episodes where we almost fell in, but we all managed to stay dry. It was lots of fun, as you can tell by the smiles. So next slide, please. And this has already also been mentioned, early detection, rapid response. It's so important to be always vigilant. They sneak in when you're not expecting them. And from my studies and from my research and from my just experience, I found, just before flowering or just when the flowers come out, late July, early August is a good time to remove them. And then the second time that I learned about when I was working with one of the volunteer groups is also in September or October. And I'll show you a photo of why that is. So that's what we try to do. Those are the two times we try to do the removals. And you have to plan to do it more than once and at least 4 years to get things really under control. But what we found is along the beach is those residents who hired students initially, once we got it to the point where there were only a few, the residents said, it's okay, now I can do it. I can look after my own property, which is great. So we're on the Wimblewood beach, we're pretty well Phragmites free. So, and even when you think it's under control, it's kind of like anything that you don't want growing on your property. They sneak in. The seed source is vast, so you always have to be vigilant. Next slide, please. This is what I was talking about when you, even though I always tell them, you know, those stalks that appear to be dead, I always say they're not dead, they're just sleeping. So in the fall, before they go dormant, they actually make next year's sprouts. And so that they can really have a jump start on the season. And so these are some photos from different places where, and I learned that at Milne Hollow because the volunteers said, can we, you know, should we, in October, they said, should we take out this Phragmites that we didn't get to? And I said, oh, well, if we do, at least there won't be any, you know, standing dead stalks to deal with in the spring. And as soon as we started spading, we found these sprouts that were under the ground. And I thought, oh, well, that's a good way to slow them down in the spring, to remove those ones in the fall before they get that chance to have that jump start. So, and I think that's last slide or second last slide. Next slide, please. Anyway, that's just, thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to questions. And that's another invasive that I'm working on. In the back of that vehicle is a whole lot of common buckthorn. So this is another one of my projects. So thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I really like thinking like a plant. I always thought I was a plant, but it's amazing how much just changing your point of view opens up so many doors as well, right? So that's amazing. Thank you. Okay, next I'll invite Travis, and you can share your screen. Awesome. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully you can see that logo there. That's the agency I work for. So my name is Travis Bartnick, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Thanks for having me here today. The Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is also known as GLFWC, and GLFWC's main office is located on the reservation of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, about 70 miles east of Duluth, Minnesota.
Oh.
So I'm actually coming to you from northern Wisconsin along the south shore of Lake Superior, just east of Duluth. So, so my work is mainly split between a focus on deer and elk management issues, but I also oversee GLFWC's invasive species program, and I've been with GLFWC since early 2015. I started off as an ecologist in their climate change program, and then eventually I shifted to my current position as a wildlife biologist in late 2016. For those of you who might not be familiar with GLFWC, GLFWC is an intertribal natural resources agency that works with 11 Ojibwe nations in the Western Great Lakes region. And we mainly work in the off-reservation areas where the Ojibwe people exercise off-reservation rights to hunt, fish, and gather across various territories that were ceded to the United States government under several treaties in the mid-1800s. And so these ceded territories stretch across large portions of what are now known as the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, as you can see on the map there. So most of our work is done in the areas outside of tribal reservation boundaries and mostly within the 1837 and 1842 ceded territories. But we do have agreements established with our member tribes where they can formally request assistance for GLFWC staff to work on their tribal lands. And we've routinely done that in the past, especially when confronting the issue of non-native Phragmites on their tribal lands. And we've also done this with other priority invasive species or non-local beings on their tribal lands in the last few years. And so I just use a couple of different terms that somewhat interchangeably, those terms being invasive species and non-local beings. And so the reason for this is that some of our tribal members see the label of invasive attached to a being as being derogatory toward those beings. And they share the belief that the Creator put all of these things on Earth for a purpose. And so it's not generally our place to label them as invasive or to treat them as any less as you might treat other beings. And so at GLFWC, we've started adopting the use of that term non-local beings to respect the request of some of our knowledge holders, tribal members, and their perspectives. And so GLFWC still has an invasive species program. We still use the invasive species term, especially when we're working with some of our partners through co-stewardship efforts. And it's a legal term, so it defines, the destructive nature of some of these beings. So sometimes it's, we want to respect different perspectives, but we also recognize that it can help to continue using the more widely used nomenclature when working with non-tribal partner agencies. So with that background information, I'm going to jump into the Phragmites site history. So I'm just going to bring up our map here. So these are all points that we have documented sites of non-native Phragmites in the ceded territory. And I'm going to talk about two main areas today. So two main geographic areas that contain the vast majority of known sites in the region. We also deal with some scattered smaller pioneer populations in the greater ceded territory, but like I said, the vast majority of them are focused on kind of near the coast, the southern shoreline of Lake Superior. So non-native Phragmites is a priority concern for Glyphwick and Glyphwick member tribes because of the way the species threatens to degrade Great Lakes coastal wetlands and other sensitive natural areas. It threatens treaty resources and medicines and wild rice habitat throughout the ceded territory. So the first area I want to speak about is closest to our offices, and that's right over here, right off. This is the Bayfield Peninsula, and so along that eastern portion of the Bayfield Peninsula, there's kind of three main clusters of where non-native Phragmites has been detected over the years, and those are centered all around wastewater treatment plants, wastewater treatment facilities that have been using non-native Phragmites in their facilities. So they had reed beds to help kind of desludge the wastewater. So many of these sites were first documented and controlled starting in about 2013, 2014. And when it was determined that all of these sites were starting to appear around these wastewater treatment facilities, the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, just on the northern tip of the Bayfield Peninsula there up by the Apostle Islands, they initiated a multi-million-dollar project using funds through the EPA to remove non-native Phragmites from those reed beds at those three wastewater treatment facilities around Chequamegon Bay. And so the effort has proven fairly successful, at least at removing the non-native Phragmites from those wastewater treatment facilities. However, a couple of years later, it was found again in the reed beds at the Red Cliff wastewater treatment facility. So they've had their hands full trying to deal with the return to those facilities. But all the sites outside of those facilities, Glyphwick has mainly been conducting follow-up monitoring and control efforts on those sites. And so we've documented at least 60 sites in this region. Some are on tribal lands, some are, but I would say the majority of them are not on tribal reservation lands, but they are within the ceded territory. And so that's how Glyphwick gets involved with the management of these sites. And so this last year in 2024, our staff visited 43 of the previously documented sites and only found new growth at 5 of those sites, and most had fewer than 50 individual stems. So when they were first found, when a lot of these sites were first found about 10 years ago, they had hundreds or even thousands of stems per site. So we've definitely come a long way, and we're using a lot, or we're dealing with a lot smaller sites than I think a lot of the folks who have presented so far have been dealing with. So we're definitely lucky in that respect. But yeah, we've seen a significant decrease, probably at least 80% in the total number of stems, but every year we find a few more new sites that have, previously gone undetected for one reason or another. And so we're maintaining, getting out there, responding to reports, conducting surveys, early detection, rapid response surveys, that sort of thing. And then the second area I wanted to talk about, or to mention, was right over in the Duluth area, Duluth Superior, Twin Ports area. This is where Minnesota's St. Louis River flows into Lake Superior. And this whole area is collectively also known as the St. Louis River Estuary. And so several dozen sites have been documented in this area since 2014. And the Wisconsin DNR did the first round of treatment on the Wisconsin side of the estuary in 2014, but then since then, GLFWC has continued conducting comprehensive shoreline surveys, annual follow-up monitoring, and control work ever since. Most of the sites that were first documented in 2014 have been eradicated. However, it seems like every year we go out there, there's several new sites that are found. They're usually pretty small sites. And we believe it's likely from some plant fragments or seeds from some of the more extensive sites that are just to the west on the Minnesota side of the estuary. And we have other partners who have been managing those sites on the Minnesota side of the estuary. There are also many small isolated sites throughout the greater ceded territory area inland from Lake Superior, both within the Great Lakes Basin and just outside of the basin. All of these other sites that GLFWC has controlled or monitored throughout the greater ceded territory in Wisconsin have typically been isolated outlier populations that were found through early detection rapid response efforts, or that were maybe reported by the Department of Transportation or other folks, maybe at the county level. So in conducting this work, GLFWC does work with many partners at the tribal level, local municipalities, county, state, federal, non-government entities, also some in the private sector, contractors who are involved with ecological restoration, that sort of thing. And so what we found is like developing these strong relationships and these strong partnerships at all levels is extremely important for this sort of work and for invasive species management in general. And let's see. Oh, the only other thing I wanted to mention with our treatment approach so far is GLFWC has primarily used herbicide spot treatment for control efforts, but we have done some manual control where it's been more feasible, or where we're working with landowners that do not want to use any kind of chemical on the property. And so at GLFWC, we try to use herbicides as a last resort. There are a lot of differing perspectives among the tribal leadership of our GLFWC member tribes. And so we try to respect that and just to try to maintain the balance and try to be very conservative with that use of herbicide if we can. So with that, I think I'll pass it along to next speaker, Curtis. But I just want to thank everyone again for being here and for having me speak today. Miigwech.
Thank you so much for that overview, Travis, of the other side of the lake. That's excellent. And now I will invite Curtis to talk us through the work that he's been doing.
Awesome. Yeah, so thanks for having me here. I'm going to briefly describe an overview of the Phragmites and invasive species work that we're doing here at Nipissing First Nation. I am the manager of environment. It's a new department. It's only about 2 years old. I started here about 3.5 years ago as the environmental officer. And we're happy to have created this new department and allowed us to open more programming to combat a lot of the things that were lacking and had gaps within our own environmental management, within our administrative boundary. So I'm going to provide a brief overview. So next slide. So just to understand where we come from, Nipissing First Nation, we're located between two major municipalities, North Bay here in Northern Ontario and Sturgeon Falls. We span 30 kilometers from east to west, but because of the topography of the shoreline, we have over 60 kilometers of shoreline that we manage, important areas of spawning for yellow walleye, numerous inlets and bays important for critical species at risk, and in addition to staple food species like our moose and deer and beaver and such. Through our ecological land classifications desktop work that we've conducted, looking at those high image orthomosaics, we've been able to delineate various habitats, which allow us to focus on areas where we are concerned, where invasive species have the most, the potential to impact those delicate ecosystems the most. In addition to that, we have about 3,400 citizens, about 900 or 1,000 of which almost a third live on reserve, and we're signatories to the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And this is my home, Nipissing First Nation, and I am also from Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island. Next slide, please. One more click. So in the beginning, the Environment Department was formed and we had many initiatives, mostly responding to critical items that members had noted for quite a while. And while we were more responsive, we tried to make a more strategic approach where we were more proactive in how we approach these issues that have been put forward by members. And as we go out on the land, we notice things, right? And the beginning of our frag story starts here when we were conducting some work along Lake Nipissing, and it was late in the fall. We noticed these bright green patches along the shoreline, and we were taken back. What is this this plant that doesn't seem to follow the other cycles of the other vegetation around it? And sure enough, next quick click there, it was Phragmites. It was sticking out like a sore thumb. There was some native frag that existed that had already went dormant. It was brown, but here was this invasive, bright colored. And an unfortunate part, this area was very close to one of our significant wetlands, known as the Jocko Point Raised Beach Complex, which is the old basic shorelines of the lake as it evolved, and these undulating low-lying levels where species at risk and habitat and migratory birds were using. So we really had to do something about this. So next slide, please. So because we were a new department, a lot of our funding was always external. The good thing is we had a great team built with certifications and capacity, individuals that come from different areas of environmental work. So we had a great team, and part of that team, we had also great tools. And one of those tools in our toolkit was the UAV. So we have drones that we use for a lot of remote sensing at the Environment Department. We've honed in on these skills and really refined them to use workflows and the best practices and get the best data. And in 2016, in 2021, we, along with the Green Shovels Initiative, decided to put this in action and pilot the use of UAVs to map these stands, which, without the use of high-tech sort of spectrometry, different spectral, wavelengths of vegetation, we could just use red RGB cameras, just a straight up camera, do it during the fall when the rest of the vegetation was dead, and perceivably we should be able to see these things. And in fact, we did. And we proved that, not only that, next slide, please. Not only that, we were able to monitor large areas of the shoreline, with relatively short amounts of field work required. And in this diagram, or this image, we're showing that in 2021 with the initiative, we did find that invasive area. And we quickly noted that this patch was not existent in 2016, whereas in the fall of 2021, it had spread with some colonies down to the south there. So this provided a tool for us not only to be able to identify new stands or where current existing ones, but to give us a way to measure those metrics. And again, this was a pilot. This refined the way we now approach Phragmites in the First Nation, and I'll get to that in a bit. So next slide, please. And as you can see, the imagery was again allowed us to not only look at baseline, get that ortho image, but to compare in future years and allow us to measure those stands. And it was a great tool. It worked very well. Next slide, please. So seeing as we had these large stands next to these areas, we had never conducted any sort of invasive programming. This was the first time we were going to do something. So in 21, we proved that we can map it. We identified some of these more larger stands that had the potential to impact some important areas. And we, along with the summer student program that we here have at Nipissing, where members, youth of our community can actually get paid to come and work with us in the summer program to do land-based activities such as this. And this was our first attempt. So next, you could see the invasive frag, how high it was, and the amount of work that it took. And the great thing is we were able to pair our summer students with other regional groups that were working on this, like Georgian Bay Forever, to give them that skill set, to teach them how to remove this stuff and what the appropriate methods were for this. And at this site, the appropriate method was the cut and drown technique. So in exchange for, Georgian Bay Forever would come here, teach our students. In exchange, we would offload some of our expertise on how we use remote sensing and UAVs. And we believe that has helped spread knowledge about these tools. And I think they have implemented that now even. So you could see the difference. And that was, this is a year after, we're still dealing with this, but because of funding, we are getting more equipment, more items in. So to this year, next slide, please. It's not as dense. It's not as dense, but it's coming back, and every year we keep chipping away at this, right? And the great thing is, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, is there's some remediation going on at the site also. So when we do cut these areas, we're seeing the swamp milkweed come back. We're seeing those native vegetation come back, and kind of pushing or corralling that invasive frag into areas that are easier to cut and less dense, making it more efficient when we do these events year after year. Next slide, please. So here's some of our work that we've done with Georgian Bay Forever and our team, and we have the combi hedge trimmers now. We have 3 of them in our arsenal now, and then numerous cane cutters, and so we have the equipment now to really make this not only a priority part of that environmental programming, but also to teach our youth on how to identify these things and what the issues are surrounding them, and how we at the nation here are going to take care of this going forward. Next slide, please. So yeah, this has become part of our environmental programming. We've only been doing this for 2 years now. We collaborate with regional groups like Georgian Bay Forever, where we're teaching our youth about these things. The great thing is at this site, there are native and invasive frag that we can showcase, show the stolons, how these things move and migrate from place to place. We have staff that are dedicated to this program now, and environmental technicians, and we also participate in DNA screening programs, looking at is this invasive, is this native throughout the entire lake now. So we've increased these programming to identify patches, not only within our administrative boundaries that we have control over, but also other places of the lake that need to be looked at. And again, we also have placement programs with Niagara College. So this is our big case study, was the Doke's Point, where we've started. Next slide, please. But part of this program involves the remediation of this site, and that involves the gathering of wild rice and planting that wild rice in those areas where we've removed frag, in the hopes that it not only replaces something that is relatively little benefit to the ecosystem with something that has huge net benefits to the local ecosystem. And we started this back in 2003. We brought our first citizens out to do this. We started harvesting it, collecting it, trying to preserve it and fight the muskrats off before they try to eat our wild rice. But there's a great story here on the narwhal, and you can read about that link there below. Next slide, please. This year, we've been building this momentum and bringing culture into remediation and into invasive species. And this year, we brought the cultural department involved and more community members. And this year, we had a ceremony as we were conducting the gathering of this wild rice. So the first time that's happened in a long time. Next slide, please. And as some other hosts noted, the removal during October, this is the site when we went back in October to clear it. And we had worked our previous attempts, but the October cutting allowed us to actually observe that the wild rice was growing and taking. And not only that, but was maturing and spreading. And just to see that our efforts were working, that we were able to go in there and cut, and that we were having different native species coming back in the addition of the wild rice. We were just happy to see this. Next slide, please. I think that might be all the slides. I don't know. Yeah, so, but we've learned a lot, and that was a very responsive approach. Now, Nipissing First Nations, and we are taking a more strategic approach, looking at the integrated pest management plan. So we've mapped all of our stands within the nation now. We have a database. We look at the ecological land classification, pair it with that and parameters of the community, and identify a real plan on how we're going to tackle these stands rather than being proactive. It took a while, you know, you want to get right in there, and then, but sometimes it's like, whoa, we got to stand back. How do we make the most out of our time when we do this? So with that, I'll just shut it down and miigwech.
Miigwech, Curtis, that was amazing. I got literal chills when you were talking about the wild rice regrowing and everything. I think I was feeding off of your energy as you were telling the story. So thank you for that. Okay, that was great. So miigwech to all of our panelists for introducing yourselves and all of the work that you do, both on the ground, but also in your communications, like even just coming here and sharing your stories so that we can listen and learn and implement our projects in make sure that our projects are we're going about them in a good way and building those good relationships. So miigwech for that. We are now going to transition into a Q&A discussion. So this is a reminder for audience members to add any questions to the Q&A chat box. And you also have the option to upvote questions from others. If there's one that you were going to ask, but it's already in there, then you can upvote that one as well. And to provide who the panelist is you're directing the question to. And there's definitely a couple in there already, but I'm going to kick us off. I have a question for all of you. There's obviously a lot of experience here on the panel. So I was hoping that each of you can share very briefly, what are some of the challenges, but also the successes that you've faced implementing Phragmites management within your regions and the communities that you've worked with? Maybe one of each. We can go, if anybody has something at the top of mind, you can jump in. Okay, Curtis.
Sure. So when we were getting our invasive species program, which is now expanded to Japanese knotweed, but when we were putting in place the eradication programs and looking at where we're mapping this and how we're going to go approach it, we realized that there was a big issue with our shared land between the Trans-Canada Highway and MTO's corridor, right? It was hard for us to do treatment and try to do what we could do within our boundaries. And even if we make laws in environmental management planning and such, that we were still dealing with the fact that there's large colonies outside of the boundary of the First Nation that would ultimately could get transported in and impacted. And so that was a challenge, is how are we going to deal with this if all around us is frag, The good thing is we were able to work with our ministries like the MTO, use those relationships we have to really get the concern home. And I can tell you that some of the work that they've done along the corridor has helped with our management, especially with the MTO treating portions of that highway that drain into the Jocko Point Raised Beach Complex and eradicating it from the corridor on our side. That was a very helpful tool. And they did it all. And it was so that I think that was a great success. And not only that, the ministries now are understanding that when you come into a First Nation, there are clean equipment protocols and there are standards that they want the proponents to adhere to. So I think we've come a long way, and that's just one of the stories I'd like to share.
That's really great to hear, because if I'm not mistaken, I recall a very large patch just kind of east of Sturgeon Falls there, so on the highway. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's still a work in progress, definitely.
Oh yeah,
it will be for a while.
Any of our other panelists have anything that comes to mind? Lynn, Dana Lynn, what do you both kind of popped up at the same time there?
Muted, but no, I'm not. Okay, yeah, it's really frustrating because there's so much in the ditches everywhere, and and then the just the movement of cars is assisting the movement of the seeds because it's creating wind, and so it's quite frustrating. Yeah, but I mean, we can only do what we can do, right? But I think for me, because I started a long time ago on that beach that I started, when I first recognized what it was, I started first I started nagging my neighbors because, as you know, it doesn't, it doesn't respect boundaries. It just goes wherever it wants to. And it was first nagging my neighbors and then trying to then I got involved in the beach association so that I could talk to the whole group, and then going beyond that. But there are always people that are resistant at the beginning, and it takes them time to accept that what you're doing. I remember some of the grassroots presentations talking about how people would laugh at them for doing that work. And I still have this one neighbor. He always, when I'm removing garlic mustard at the side of the road, he always says, "Oh, you're wasting your time," and blah blah blah. And there's still those people that are always reluctant to do anything, and they just want to leave things the way they are, not because they honor the plants that are there, but more because they just are not interested in the land, and which makes me kind of sad. But I have to say that over the years that I've been working on this, I've been able to establish more of a, the longer you do it and the more success you have, the more people start to accept that maybe that's the way they would like things to be. And I think the whole idea of, experience is the best teacher, and modeling behaviors is the most important thing. I think that to get those late adopters to change, there is always people that everybody learns in a different way, and they learn by observing and seeing what's happening. And so I think that it's really important to remember to be patient with those people, because they just learn in a different way. And everybody has free will. We can't tell somebody what they should do, but we can do the things that are important to us. And maybe along the way they'll just start to think, oh, maybe there is something to what you're doing. And when they start to see the diversity that comes back, and start to see, I mean, one of the people on the beach, he started to remove we removed the Phragmites for him, and then he had other plants come, and then he had butterflies come. And I got this email. It's like, I can see butterflies now that I didn't see before. So sometimes it just, you just have to be patient. And so probably that's my success, is that more and more people, it took 20 years, but more and more people have begun to appreciate the work that it takes to remove those by the way, Travis, I'm going to start using that term, non-local beings. I love that. That just makes so much more sense to me, because it's not their fault they're here. Mostly it's human beings' fault, but
Exactly. Yeah.
they don't have a place in the environment. They don't follow the 4 directions teachings. They don't share the land. They're not kind. They rely on their strength and try to overpower everything. So we have to be understanding of them, but at the same time, the other beings that are here, the ones that really belong here, they need to to have their land back, just like many of us.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah. And that's a loose English translation from an Ojibwe-Moan. So I could share the Ojibwe-Moan.
I would
phrase
love
with-
that. I would love
Okay.
that.
All right.
Yeah, thank you, Travis. Because I'm always trying to learn more words in the language. I'm late to learn these things, but I always want to learn them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lynn. What a great experience you've had over the last 20 years. And I think that's very empowering and insightful for the rest of us to listen to. And And here, especially, I mean, me myself, I'm only 30, so I'm still starting this journey. So I look forward to having similar experiences. Dana Lynn, I think you had
Yeah,
something you'd
and there
like to
was,
add.
yes, going back to the comment about it's a living being. When we attend communities. We had one individual. He tried to tell me that it was a medicine, that he was told it was a medicine from China, and so we do respect that it is one of our relatives, and that yes, it has come from another area. But what it does is it disturbs the harmony of what has taken place, and it takes away the balance that our ecosystem is used to. So that's one of the things, and that we want to restore that harmony. We want to bring back that everything, because everybody and everything depends on one another. And so this plant has come in and it's destroying that harmony. So yes. And we try to explain that when we go into the territories, that this is what's taking place.
Thank you. Yes, that's such a great way of putting it into perspective. You can still respect a being and understand where it's coming from, but acknowledge that this isn't its place. Yeah. Okay. There are quite a few questions in the chat, but I'm going to look to Gabby to see if we can keep asking questions or if we need to potentially wrap up as it is 1:20.
I think we probably can use about 5 more minutes, and then we'll
Okay,
just cut our break after the control session a little shorter. So yeah, 5 minutes.
amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. There's actually there's so many questions in here. I'm gonna do this one here. So the guest asked, I've read and heard about Indigenous perspectives on invasive species as building a relationship with the species and considering the species' usefulness in local ecosystems. Do any of you or of our knowledge speakers have thoughts on this perspective? I'm still learning myself, but as an educator helping to guide others in this learning, I'm trying to sort out how to reconcile this usefulness aspect of Phragmites in local to Toronto ecosystems with knowing that it should be addressed and hopefully removed. I think this question kind of ties on what you were just mentioning, Dana Lynn, too, is that it can be useful and it might be useful to its native range, but still understanding that this isn't the place for it because it disrupts that harmony, right? Is there anything that anyone would like to add to that? Or I can ask another question. Okay.
I just
Oh,
want to
yeah.
confirm that whole idea of harmony and balance among all of our relatives. And when you bring in something, there are some plants that are non-local beings that have managed to fit in, like, for example, daisies are not native, but they have managed to fit in and the animals have learned to use them. At this point, I feel as though, but they don't ever take over the way some other non-local beings do. So I think we have to think in terms of how the species, the particular species is fitting in or to that harmony and balance or not. That
Absolutely. I agree. There's a couple questions in here for Curtis on the mapping tools. If you'd like to kind of just briefly explain what drone mapping you used as well.
So we use Matrice 300 RTK. It allows you to, and I am a trained pilot, so I do have my advanced pilot certificate, and you do have to go through that sort of training. Matrice 300 RTK is important because we use ground control points, and with ground control points, they're tied to the ground and the imagery, and we use a high precision GPS to measure the center of that checker box. And when we fly the drone, we can tie it into the real world elevations and allow us to really accurately measure the size of the patch or changes over time. And in addition, if you're gathering the data, you might as well do it properly so that you could use that data in the future, perhaps, right? If you have elevation data with it too. So the Matrice 300 following the proper workflows. And I also use This is a P1. You can't. I'm not sure on this drone here. This is the P1 35 millimeter wide angle camera we use because it covers large areas, and you can put it up in the air and do a couple of passes, and you can cover huge amounts of areas with that with very high resolution ground sampling distance. So 1 pixel could be like a couple centimeters in the real world. So it's really crazy. In addition to that, we use different software, whether it's DJI Terra or Pix4D, mostly Pix4D, including the ortho images, and then using ArcGIS. Those are basic tools.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. There's still a few questions in there that are kind of more related to monitoring and management techniques, and then a couple questions on kind of working with MNRF and MTO. I encourage those who have asked those questions to reach out to Gabby and Vicky or Janice, and they can maybe help answer those questions with the help of the panelists afterwards as well. So there's so much more all of us listening can learn from all of you, and I want to thank you, Big Chi Miigwech, for sharing your experiences and suggestions on how to go about our projects in a good way with all of us. I know everyone listening has learned some way to improve their work and engage with Indigenous communities and partners, and has found this discussion so valuable. So miigwech again, and miigwech to everyone for joining us. That concludes this session. So I will pass it back to Gabby to direct us to what's next. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you so much, Darissa, for leading that panel discussion. That was excellent. And I did just want to note to panelists, you are able to answer within the Q&A. If you did see any question, you can answer in there. And Janice and Vicky and I will also go through and answer some questions too. So thanks very much. We appreciate your time. All right, for our next session, we're going to be talking about control information updates. We have 3 talks within this. First up, we have Tom Cowan from the Ministry of Conservation and Parks. Tom will be speaking to us about legislative and practical considerations of using aquatic herbicides. So I'd like to welcome Tom, and I'll let you take it from here, Tom, and share your screen. Thank you.
Okay, I have the screen shared. I hope everyone can see that. Are we good?
It looks great. Yep, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you for having me. So my name is Tom Cowan. I'm the Regional Pesticide Specialist working out of the London office. And I just want to talk a little bit today about some of the legislative and practical considerations of using aquatic herbicides. So when we were able to use Habitat Aqua, it first came in, we hadn't had a lot of experience with our permitting systems through it. And since then, we've gained a lot of information and experience. And from our point of view, from the ministry's point of view, I just want to share with you some of the things that you may want to consider if you are indeed starting a Phragmites control program where you will be including herbicides as part of the control method. And just before I begin, I'm really encouraged to hear all the integrated pest management work that's being done. And for me, that is the key to any realistic management practice that will last for a longer period of time. Chemicals are a good option, and they are only used when necessary. And from what I've seen in the larger scale projects, and even some of the smaller ones too, everyone is really taking that to heart. I'm really glad to see that. Okay, so from our work that we've been doing, I've noticed a few things. So from the legislative side, there's some considerations of licensing, pesticide label instructions, the permits, which is where MECP comes in, the cosmetic pesticide ban, which can impact you depending if you're using aquatic or land-based applications, and notification and signage, which is something that is part of the legislation either for land application or aquatic application. And just some of the practical methods too, like which application method to use, the drift management considerations that you have to have, downstream impacts if you're using it in slow-moving water systems, pedestrian access to the application area. So we see some trails and some trail accesses that we want to make sure that we're covering those if you're using application of herbicide in those areas. And we've talked about this a little bit, but public perception is also a huge issue, especially when using pesticides, and particularly when using pesticides in water, we've seen. So just running through on the pesticide licensing part, to use pesticides in water to control aquatic weeds, you will need an aquatic vegetative exterminator license. Okay, this is required for Phragmites control in water. The question we get, there are two types. There is a license class, so you can have a license to do the work, or you can be a technician, and a technician is someone who's supervised by a license holder to do the work. The technician takes a course on pesticide safety and then gets additional training on how to use the pesticide. People have asked us, can a technician use this? The answer is no. Technicians are not allowed to use Class B pesticides, which are restricted pesticides. So Habitat Aqua is a restricted pesticide, so you have to have a license. So if you've got a crew of people working, all of them have to hold the aquatic vegetation exterminator's license to apply pesticides and do that work. Okay, so again, multiple people on a crew, all spraying, all need a license. Okay, now having a look at the pesticide label is really important because that is part of the federal requirements, but it's also part of the provincial requirements. So within our legislation, we say you got to follow the label. So that means that it is enforceable from our point of view. But that label is also really interesting because you need to look at where it allows you to put the product. It talks about treatment locations. It gives offsite impact warnings. It gives restricted reentry intervals, the REI, which is pretty low for this particular product. Talks about not applying to irrigation canals. And if you're in sort of the Chatham-Kent area of southwestern Ontario, or in areas that kind of share drainage systems and irrigation canals are kind of mixed, you might want to look at what's going on downstream before you start applying upstream, right? It also gives information on drinking water intakes, buffer zones, shutdown periods, and that sort of stuff. Now, for drinking water intakes for municipal and registered systems, we can see that when we review your permit. So we'll be able to determine those. For non-registered systems or people who are pulling out of a lake or a river and we don't know about, you gotta do the work of walking upstream around the lake area, looking for those drinking water intakes or those just regular water intakes as well. So those are things that we're gonna ask you when we ask you to do the permit. So moving on to the permit side of things, there's two things, when a permit is needed and when it's not. For the most part, you're gonna need a permit unless you don't. So I'll go over some of the exemptions in a minute, but essentially the permit's required for any application to water, right? Unless you have an exemption. You submit the permit to the regional pesticide specialist for review, and I'll have a list of those later on in the presentation. And I'm not going to go into the specifics about how to apply for a permit because that's a whole other presentation all in itself. But we do have a permit application guide that you can use, and it walks you through the whole system. We've also got contact information. So as the pesticide specialist in your region, they can help you walk through the whole application process, okay? They're very individual in nature, the permit applications, because every application site is different, especially the Phragmites. There are large programs, medium programs, small programs. They'll all have different requirements that we can't fit into any one guide. So we're going to ask you a lot of questions depending on your program and how it's set up. Now, a permit is not required if you're applying to a drainage ditch. And this is more so for, I guess, like the MTO, the roads people who are looking after that particular site. If the water that's in there is not moving at the time. So if you've got the stagnant water in a drainage ditch that's not moving anywhere, you can apply the aquatic herbicide to that location without a permit, and that's fine. Just make sure it's not moving, right? You can also apply the pesticide to a pond with no inflow or outflow at any point during the year, okay? And it can be performed by the property owner or an employee of the property owner. If you hire someone who is doing the pesticide application for you, they will require a permit for that pond. The exemption only applies specifically to the owner, and as long as that pond does not inflow or outflow at any time of the year and is wholly contained on their property, right? So it's meant for people just doing local control on their own land. All right, I'm not going to go too deep into the other legislation that's required, but there are some situations where you're going to run into federal legislation and other provincial legislation. And we typically are the main contact. We can sort of, guide you as to where you should go to get more information. So one thing you'll look at is the Fisheries Act, which is run by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So they have exemptions for invasive species control that you'll want to look into. The Aquatic Invasive Species Regulations under the Fisheries Act. There's Species at Risk Act, which is both federal and provincial. So applications have to take those into account as well. I've got some contact information up here. I'm going to share this presentation with the group as well, but if you want to take a screenshot of that right now, feel free. This information is going to get you in touch with the people who can tell you where to go next for specific parts of your project that don't involve the MECP. Okay, so now if you have Phragmites control that goes onto the land, we've already discussed a little bit about this in the previous presentations, but there are some exemptions to the pesticide ban that will apply. So as soon as you're applying it to land, now it comes under land application, comes under pesticide ban legislation by the province. If you're applying it to a drainage ditch, okay, this is with no water at the time of the extermination, okay, it's a public work so long as it's like on a roadside or it's giving access to something. So most drainage ditches along roadsides are public works. That's fine. You can apply there. Stormwater management ponds are run by the municipality, right? They are public works. You can apply there under that exemption. To use that exemption, okay, you will need to have integrated pest management certification to apply to a public work, and you will also need to have the industrial vegetation license to do that work as well. That also requires some yearly reports. And again, more information about this can be provided. Just get in touch with me or one of the specialists, and we can give you more information on that. The exemption that most people will use for municipalities and people who private landowners will use the natural resources exemption. So if you're going to manage, protect, establish, or restore a natural resource, okay, you're exempt from the pesticide ban. Now, if you're working for a conservation authority or the Ministry of Natural Resources, running a program in conjunction with them, you do not need to apply for that written opinion from the Ministry of the Environment, okay, or the Ministry of Natural Resources. If you're, say, a municipality and you're running your own program, or a large landowner running your own program, you will need that written opinion. And that written opinion is better applied to from the Ministry of Natural Resources from one of their district workstations. Okay, so you apply to them. They can provide you with information of how to go about obtaining that, and I believe there's a system in place for that. All right, so now we've gone over the legislative side of things. I know I did a pretty quick run through that. I want to talk a little bit about the practical considerations that we have noticed and seen some issues with as we move forward. It's really important, like, evaluate the location before you start spraying to ensure that the site conditions are compatible with your chosen method of application. So the picture to the right here, you can see it looks like some spray drift occurred, but what actually happened there was a Phragmites control program was being done along the ditches, but it was being used was basically a tree gun. So the pesticide went right through the Phragmites and right into the pasture that was along the roadside. And there's more of these happening all on the road. So whoever did it was just driving by and doing some drive-by spraying. Okay, Phragmites can grow very tall. We've all seen that. To get the necessary coverage, you may need to elevate yourself above the canopy to spray down. I've seen situations where people have wanted to spray up, and that's a little bit dangerous because now whatever goes up comes down, so you'll likely be in a cloud of spray. Okay, drone application is something that there's been some research being done on it. It's currently not on the label. Okay, you cannot apply this by drone unless you're involved in some kind of research application for it. Right, so we have been working with Janice on this as well. So that's being done. So if you're thinking of using a drone for application, you'll have to wait till that product is listed on the label for our past use. Okay, drift management is really important, and what's really good so far is we haven't seen any issues of large-scale drift complaints when using Imazapyr. We did put some money aside to do some sampling, but we haven't seen any off-target site impacts with Imazapyr in water so far, okay? But the label does give you some specific instructions to avoid drift, because depending on the method of application, the drift could go a lot further. So for example, if you're applying it by helicopter or rotary wing aircraft, there's a lot more opportunity for drift based on how that pesticide is being applied than for, say, like a handheld backpack sprayer. Best management practices are on the pesticide label, and they're really good, and you should follow them. Accurate mapping is really important, and I think Curtis went over some of the work that he's been doing on accurate mapping, and man, that does put a lot of good information in your back pocket when you're developing these control strategies. For large Phragmites stands, right, apply from the outside to the inside if you're going to be using a system where you have to stand up on a ledge and spray in. That avoids excess drift because you're not, firing over top of the canopy to outside of the canopy like we saw in the previous slides. And if you can use low drift nozzles and pressure combinations, that reduces pesticide drift because it makes the droplet size larger. That's also extremely helpful. And like I said, it looks like the people who have been doing the work have been doing an excellent job. We haven't received any complaints so far on that. Something that Janice, I think she's going to talk a little bit about later, but it was part of the presentation, so I'll just talk about it here. The label allows for treatment to flowing streams, but they got to be slow flowing streams. So you're not going to be applying this to places that have like massive rapids. But some herbicide will leave the application area. That's just the nature of pesticide applications in general. It will go somewhere else. The trick is to put as little as possible in that other place. So we didn't have any information on this, and I couldn't find anything. So we just had to collect some data for ourselves. And this is based on a drone application that was done in flowing systems, a slow flowing system. And what's interesting about this is we found upstream, of course, 0 application, but within the frag stand after application, that's less than a part per million in the water right after the spray. And that's what's telling us is that there's significant interception of the pesticide onto the leaves of the plants. At the edge of the application areas, that's downstream just after the application areas had stopped, we get about 2.4 parts per billion. That's a day of spray. And then further downstream into the mixing area, we get around 2.1 parts per billion. These are very small amounts. 3 days after the application, what's interesting about this is we had a rain event that occurred between day 0 and day 3. But even within that frag stand, that concentration has dropped down to 5.7 parts per billion, right? And again, downstream edge, 1.6, and then downstream mixing is 2.5. And I think what happened here is there was another Phragmites control project going on downstream, and I think we had a little bit of mixing in with that, so I didn't quite gauge my my sample locations as well as I could have.
About 1 minute left. 1 minute.
Yep. Hang on a second here. I've lost my screen. There we go. Okay, so we followed that up in the spring, and we basically got nothing. It's really close to our method detection limit. So what's that showing is the applications that happen in the fall do not carry over significantly to the spring. So we're very confident that whatever's applied in the fall, we're not going to get significant numbers coming back in the spring. Okay, so just a quick comment about public perception of pesticide use and notice signs. It's really important to get public engagement, especially for large-scale projects. We do ask you when you apply for your permit to give us objectors who are involved, and those people can bring their objections to us. An objection does not mean the permit's not going through. It just means we have to consider what they say. We will give you requirements for notification on the permit of where you're supposed to put your signs. Larger projects, we will ask for more public involvement and more public engagement. And that might be like public meetings, that might be like publications as well. Okay, so for you to contact us, we have our pesticide specialists. Here are our regions and the various municipalities within those regions. So look where you fit in, and you can give us a call, and we're more than happy to help you with everything else. Okay, and that will end the presentation. So again, any questions, feel free to ask or put them in chat, or you can just email one of us on the screen.
Thanks so much, Tom. That was excellent and some really useful practical advice there. So thank you very much. I think people are still probably working on their questions. So maybe if you don't mind just keeping an eye on the Q&A and responding there, that would be
Sure.
great. But yes, thank you for joining us, and we'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you. So next up, we have Dr. Janice Gilbert of the Invasive Phragmites Control Center, our very own. And Janice is going to be talking about considerations for use of spray drones to control invasive Phragmites in sensitive habitats. So Janice, I'll let you share your screen and take it away.
Thank you, Gabby. Is my presentation up?
Not yet.
Hopefully. Oh, let me try this.
Sometimes it's like you have to click the share button a couple times. So
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, always works when I'm practicing.
that's how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah. And how about that?
Nothing yet.
No.
I can see if I can get it up here, Janice, just a second.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
How about that?
Okay, yes, we can see the PowerPoint. You just need to put it into presentation mode. That looks great. Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm just going to motor right ahead here. Yeah, so spray drones and talking about today, also known as UAVs or RPAS, and really quickly evolving technology. I'm watching this for a number of decades, or at least a decade now. Japan's been using them for at least 2 decades in the agricultural section. And what I learned when I first investigated this about a decade ago was a lot of the drone companies were switching from military use, seeing a real business opportunity in the agricultural sector. So a lot of benefits for use of spray drones when they do come on board. There's a number of different sizes and models, and Canada and the United States are just beginning to approve use. This is drone use is legislated under Transport Canada. And although it's not illegal to sell a spray drone or buy a spray drone, as Tom just mentioned, you can't use a spray drone to apply any of the pesticide products that we have in Canada, with one exception just came through as Garlon, and that's extremely highly regulated. And basically, for those folks that don't know, for a label change to occur on a pesticide, the chemical company has to submit the application to the Pest Management Regulatory Agency for approval. And with that, you know, when they're looking to approve a label change to add a spray drone, there's a lot of questions they have that, like Tom mentioned, like even with Habitat Aqua, like, you know, there's so many things it's just new product for us, and you know, how do we know what's best, how it's best to use? And Jason DeVoe with OMAFRA, he's been doing a lot of spray drone research as well in the agricultural field, and he really in this article summarized why there's just so much research still required to get a lot of the information. It's because with these products, if they're currently being used for be applied with a helicopter or fixed wing, the droplets behave very differently than they do for a drone. And it's basically to do with where the product is applied, like on the drone itself. There's downwash from those little props. There's a lot of variables that impact where the droplets will move. How fast is the drone going? How high up is it above the plant material being sprayed? What is the pitch, the angle that it's on, wind speed, direction? All of these things really have an impact on these droplets. And then the other question is efficacy. The tank's a lot smaller, so you use much lower water volume. The exposure to the pilot themselves, and then or the people working with the pilot, and then for ag use, accumulated residue on the plant material. It's a really big question to be answered. So as Jason mentioned, you know, before spray drone for ag use is going to be rolled out, there's going to be a lot of BMPs developed, best practices figured out, pesticide safety certification, and a lot of training that has to take place. Well, from my perspective, you know, the rationale for using spray drones to restore natural areas is absolutely huge. We've made a significant progress with the tools we have on the landscape already. There's numerous examples where we've made great strides in reducing high density Phragmites to just minimal small patches using the methods we have. And these methods, that Long Point, that emergency use program, they're really successful when they use helicopters, and then ground application using the Marshmasters, and you know, when shrunk it down just with backpack spraying. And we've done a lot of these methods as well, amphibious vehicles spraying from, and then getting the high density patches down to manageable backpack. From my perspective, the ability to use spray drones is going to be just so helpful, because helicopters, and someone said it's not appropriate to bring in a helicopter. There is a big buffer from obstacles like trees. You don't want to bring a big helicopter in to spray a little patch, even though it's high density. It doesn't make sense, or numerous little patches. And then the density of the Phragmites themselves may be overkill and just not appropriate. For the specialized vehicles, they're track vehicles. So you track in, you track out. And when you have to spray large stands, there's a lot of tracks. And then once you sprayed the frag, the next year, I would say this is the hardest part, because they need plants to come back, and you're have to traverse through them to get to the site to do the spraying, the sparse spraying that's required. And then some areas the manual crew just can't walk through safely or get to the frag. So just finishing up a 3-year research project. I was so excited when Christopher Budd and Brad Hayhoe contacted me in 2021. So we've applied for a research authorization to apply Habitat Aqua. Would you be interested in managing this research? And I said, oh, thank you. Absolutely no question. So the research it allowed 10 distinct sites to be treated each year up to a maximum of 2 hectares. Chris and Brad had already reached out to Adrian Rivard at Drone Spray Canada. I was so excited he is an absolutely amazing drone pilot. But beyond that, he grew up on a farm. He has an agricultural background, and he has many decades of experience as a commercial pilot, as well as he's been flying a model plane since he was a kid. So he's exceedingly high skill level with the drone application as a pilot. So just a real joy to work with. So in addition to the RA, that's a federal research permit, we also had to get permission at the province. So we're using Habitat Aqua. So all the aquatic extermination permits were required, and Tom was exceedingly helpful with that, coming to the sites and providing guidance. We also needed a letter from the director as well to undertake this research work. And I'm just so grateful. There's a number of partners that were really keen to work with us on this project and help us out with it. So with this, because it's research, there's a research component, and Dr. Rebecca Rennie was willing to help us out with that. And Grace, her master's student, did the bulk of the research for us. I'm just so grateful. Grace is presenting later in the day here, but not on this, but she did phenomenal work for her master's. I'm just very appreciative of that. So Grace looked at a number of factors: the control efficacy, accuracy, drift, where the droplets, if they would penetrate through the leaf canopy. We actually were really curious. If we're using a Mazapyr in the water under trees, would we kill the trees? So we did a really neat study there. And then also OPWG as a partner, they have a really high-tech drone component to their facility for protecting the nuclear facilities. And so they came out with their drones and did imagery of all the vegetation, so we could compare pre-post vegetation. Tom just mentioned the water quality, very big part of that. So I'm not going to get into that too much detail. And then from my perspective, I was really curious, in terms of the site logistics, how do we actually make this work? How can we get Adrian to these sites and provide them with the appropriate sight lines? What kind of equipment modifications do we have to use? What kind of drone is best? All these other factors. The water volumes, very interested in that. And then once we got rid of the high density frag, how do we do the low density spot treating? So
3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Really? Oh, okay. Adrian landed on very quickly a really effective concentration, 100 liters of water per hectare at the 4.67 liters. High control efficacy. For the most part, almost all the sites are almost 100% control. This is from Grace's work. There's a couple of sites we got lower efficacy, around 70%. And Adrian and I think it may be our water source or some other weird factor going on. We're trying to tease out. 90% target accuracy. So there's some off-site target. And Adrian and I, again, have looked at the why of that. And we know it wasn't wind, it wasn't drift. It was more false positive on our ID of which a cattail, separating the cattail from the frag, or also I'll get to in a minute, the difficulty of flying a spray drone when there's obstacles and having to switch on and off the switch. Basically, we didn't find any impact on trees that were under where we had treated, where there was water. Tom already talked about the water quality results, not a concern. And basically, from my perspective, significant increase in control efficacy compared to any of the ground methods we use. So considerations: what type of drone is most appropriate? There are some really big drones out there for the agricultural use. We landed on the DJI T50. We tried a different model from Texas. Wasn't as we weren't able to modify the software or the drone themselves to tweak them more for an environmental purpose as opposed to ag. The 10-liter tank size was absolutely perfect. We don't need it a bigger size. Logistics, a lot of times we have to carry everything in, not just the drone, the batteries, the generator, all of the product. So you still need to do a lot of physical labor to get to site. And then with that, moving around, this was a floating mat. It's owned by the University of Waterloo. There was no other way we could have controlled frag at the site. Not helicopter. We tried backpack, would fall through the floating mat. Not safe. So this technology has actually allowed us to save this really valuable ecosystem from Phragmites. And so, yeah, but it was tough to get in, for sure. Lots of Sherpa work. Here's John Wild at Ronda Fringe Park. He made this platform that Adrian could put the drone on to take off and land. He also used it to actually improve his sight line through some of these areas to spray the drone. Sometimes we had to use our boats with the platform, either land it and take off from the boat itself, or get Adrian to a site close enough where he could fly the drone over the water. Plus, we had to bring all of the equipment that's required as well, as I mentioned before, to access these sites. Sometimes we had to use our terrestrial vehicles as well. So the benefit was, instead of tracking all the way through spraying, we're just making one track in, one track out. And doing modifications to our equipment. We're still improving how we're doing this to allow access, but significant improvements. Obstacles. Like, this is where Adrian's skill set, like Sean, like it looks like it might be easy. It's exceedingly difficult what he did. And he has a really high skill set level of pilots working with him, and none of them could do what he did. He is absolutely exceptional, flying around all the obstacles, and he had to manually turn on and off the switch. You know, in agricultural settings, or for some of these areas, you can fly the drone around, do the perimeter. The program will map the overlay for the spraying of the drone and the pattern that the drone can take, and then you can just let it go on autopilot. Not so for a lot of these sites. Those green lines on this map, that's what Adrian did manually, flying the drone. And so with that, he's watching for the obstacles, the standing dead trees, or the live trees that are out there, flying around any other obstacle, plus staying low enough to get the droplets just on top of the frag, plus avoiding the frag. And so he has to do all this, plus turn the spray button on and off. Your retrieval plan. Retrieval plan, thank you. The drone might hit something and go into the system. Do you have a way to get it out? Fortunately, where we are working, a lot of these areas could go in and get it out, but that's not the case for all of these sites. So working with Adrian to get a sky cart with a grappling hook so we can retrieve in these areas we just can't get in any other way. Timing, this doesn't matter what application method, you really have to be aware of the best timing to go do this work in these ecosystems. Just because you can control 100 acres doesn't mean you should. If that's all the habitat that's left for the birds for structure, for nesting, for the muskrats, maybe you do it in sections. And think about it, erosion. If you're along the edge of a lake or a river, maybe you want to leave a buffer until the native plants are recovered back in behind. So you leave that fringe, and then you remove the fringe once the native plants are recovered. We did this a lot on Lake Huron when the lake levels were high and we were doing the cutting to drown. Biomass removal, it's really tough to spot spray, find live frag using the drone in standing dead. It's much, much better if you can remove. This time of year is perfect for removing biomass if you can get out there. And low density control, this is something I'm really interested in fine tuning. We did some research comparing the drone accuracy with spot spraying versus backpack and looking to further improve that. Yeah, so I have some concerns. Like I said, people can go buy a spray drone, and I know there's a lot of interest in doing that. Just be aware that whoever's flying that drone really should have a high skill level, lots of hours of expertise, practice flying these drones. And it's different if you're collecting imagery versus spraying. So with that, the wrong people as pilots could possibly do more harm than good. But I'm so excited this technology is coming. I think it's going to be another game changer for us in terms of our ability to restore these ecosystems, just like Habitat Aqua was. Yeah, and I just I know I'm out of time. Sorry. I just want to thank everybody that certainly helped us with our project, and I don't think I have any time to answer questions.
Thanks, Janice. No, it was really great information. There was one just question in the Q&A, so maybe if you don't mind just typing the answer to that, everyone should be able to see that. But thanks so much, Janice. That's really interesting work. Excited to see how that moves forward. Thanks so much. All right, next up, I'm going to invite Jenny Bershatsky and Jonathan Wild from Ontario Parks to talk about their work there. The title of their presentation is 10 Years of Lost Boots and Ladders, Phragmites in Ontario Parks Southwest. Really love that title. And good to see you again, John, as well. And I'll let you guys take it away.
My presentation up there, Gabby?
It's up, but if you want to just put it into presentation mode, that'd be great. That's perfect. Looks great. Thank you.
A lot of stuff that Janice just talked about, we can power through to make up some time in your presentation. This is kind of looking back at 10 years of different herbicide application projects within Rondo, and I've also done a bit of work Long Point and Turkey Point. Jenny's sort of covered the rest of the Southwest zone. I always use the term a mercenary for hire in terms of helping out people on projects. I've been here since the early 2000s when some initial attempts were made with dryland herbicide treatment and trying to blanket it with plastic. I was around for the Janice and Frank era when the pilot project took off at the McLean's wetland outside the park. A lot of success with treatment of high density, sort of became the poster for treating frag with herbicide to restore a wetland. Some label restrictions limited to dry land spraying, some limited access in some areas with trees and water. They couldn't do everything. Limits on burning on private property. But with the successes of that pilot program Janice and Frank had, we kind of carried that into the Rondo Marsh and started treating high density areas in here in the late 2010s into 2012, 13. Large cells, a lot of equipment support, a lot of human support in terms of research, monitoring, and actually spraying. I'll hand it over to Jenny to talk about some of the other stuff going on in the zone.
Yeah, so from there, we've kind of spread out to all of the rest of the zone. So this map is just showing where all of the parks are within Ontario Park Southwest Zone. And all of those little numbers, there's some amount of a frag project treating, removing happening there. So some of the photos there around, there's a few sites that are really easy to access. We have extremely remote sites like up in Cabot, and then way down at the bottom to Sister Island. It's kind of everywhere, and we're hitting it with pretty much everything we've got, both partner-wise and internally. And you can go to the next one. So sort of building off of all of that work that started at Rondo, we did some work at Ordnance Beach at Turkey Point Provincial Park. Janice's team did quite a bit of work treating in there on the dry land. And then there was no ability to treat over water, and the water sort of came up, so they couldn't get everything, and that eventually all spread back in to cover that beach wetlandish area there. So with some of the projects that we've been involved in, the emergency use registration, for that first crack at using a herbicide over water, we were able to get the rest of that and treat quite a few areas within Turkey Point Provincial Park, and in some of the private marshes, to get rid of a lot of that that was left there. So that photo there is just in the Turkey Point Hunt Club lands, where they did a little prescribed burn after treating, and opened up the rest of those marshes. There you go.
I was brought in. Janice talked to me initially about trying to burn the biomass off after they'd treated areas, eliminate the dead material to allow the native seedbed better opportunity to germinate, helps follow up herbicide treatments. You're able to see the new green shoots and spray them easier the following season. Some of the difficulties were planning those areas to burn based on where Janice was going to be able to spray in a given season. There's timelines on burning windows and when we can and can't burn in terms of planning. We were able to successfully burn a few small blocks in the marsh in 2009. As you can see, some of the fire was a little intense. One advantage that we've had in burning tallgrass prairie here at the park for the last 20 years, there's development of a fire prediction model that more accurately represented like open grass tools. And the Southern Fire Advisor at the time, Nolan Short, he actually recommended that we could use this as a model for burning Phragmites. So in 2012, we burned a couple of sections in the south end of our marsh that were accessible. You can see the difference in the flame intensities in that bottom fire compared to the one from 2009. Enables us to stay within the low complexity PB prescribed burn application window that we're certified for. Kind of building on that, we did do a high complexity burn with AFFES partnership with them to work on training for pilots, for incident commanders, for their own prescribed burn bosses, for fire investigations, etc. It allowed us to burn a whole bunch of treatment areas from multiple years, so kind of stuff from 2010-ish up to 2013 treatments. Able to cover vast areas in the marsh under the high complexity. We're not limited by hectarage on what we can burn. Some of the difficulties, funding. We were lucky to have a lot of in-kind funding from people in terms of training and development. The labor ahead of time in terms of rolling the fuel down to make it susceptible to fire. Standing frag won't burn unless the winds are above 25 kilometers an hour. And if you exceed the 25 kilometers an hour, you can't use the helicopter ignition technique. So we had to modify the fuel by laying it down with the rollers that you see in the bottom left there. Spent very cold nights out with Janice in the middle of the night, rolling frag in the marsh. In order to pull it off, we managed to burn about 100 hectares. Jenny, you want to talk about EUR?
Yeah, so then building off of that, there was a submission to PMRA to have the ability to use a herbicide over water before Habitat Aqua was available. And so we got a 5-year approval to use Roundup Custom so that we were able to treat some of those areas further inland into the marsh and Rondo and some areas at Long Point as well, using the helicopter to do that. So the map there is just showing a few of those areas, which you can see in that photo that John just flipped to. Those were kind of all of our patches where we either couldn't get equipment into or we didn't want to get equipment into because of some of the values that were there, whether it be species at risk or there's too many down trees, whatever it is. So that program was really successful. We treated quite a few hectares of frag that were pretty much 100% dense frag stands in the park there. If you want to go to the next slide. After that first year of the helicopter was 2016, we kind of ran into the problem in Rondo that we treated all these areas that we were able to treat that didn't have a lot of tree cover. There wasn't very many obstacles the helicopter had to get around. Now we had to figure out, okay, how do we continue to do this within this 5-year period? So we pretty much threw whatever equipment we had at it. So using airboats, using tow-behind machines, some of the Argo-like machines, ladders, just to get into some of those areas and work at chipping away some more of that frag. So that map there, the green that you see is all of the remaining patches of frag that were either too dense with tree cover to get into with any of these other methods, or we just haven't figured out how to treat them yet. So we kind of moved from the bay side around the point over to the beach side and had some successes in treating some of this frag in these ephemeral ponds along the shoreline of Rondo, which are very important for Fowler's toads. So we left all the frag standing there. We let it sort of just disintegrate naturally, which was less impactful on the dunes and any of the reptiles that might be using that area there. So then after that, that first kind of couple cracks at treating that, we actually had higher numbers of Fowler's toads that we found when we counted in those areas. So we sort of had an immediate improvement for them because we cleared the frag out of their little breeding ponds down at the end. which is excellent. Yeah, and then Janice talked about the drone stuff. So that sort of was the next step for us anyways, was really great, is treating in those areas where there's tons of tree cover. How do we get around here with doing the least amount of impact in some of these areas where we have things like Fowler's toads, where we have all the species at risk that we don't want to be bringing machines into. So this was really great. We had limits on sizes of blocks that we could treat. So John and I did some extra legwork to go out and see where we could get the best bang for our buck. And then some of these photos are just some additional photos from Janice's showing a treated cell compared to the non-treated. Yeah. So some of the things that were similar between both these projects, research projects, there's lots of planning and permitting that goes into it. Tom talked about all the permits that go into doing some of these things. We had quite a few outreach sessions with just the locals, local communities, Indigenous partners. We're doing these projects within provincial parks. We had the extra considerations around how are we communicating these projects to our visitors, to people that are using these spaces. So having doing these projects in places like Rondo, Pinery, we can lean on our discovery staff to kind of share those things. But yeah, lots of signage, lots of opportunity to talk to people about what's going on. And then none of these could really be done without the partnerships. Janice mentioned a bunch of them. We really couldn't have done any of this work without any of our partners kind of holding our hands along the way. And then, yeah, so some more common things between the sites. So with our parks I'll call them remote. They're not that remote because we're in Southern Ontario, but it's hard to get things into places. We've had to use our brains to figure out how we're actually going to get in here. So lots of specialized equipment and lots of not so specialized equipment, and figuring out how to access these remote sites. So having the ability to find these people that own airboats, that have that thing in the bottom, the sherp, to get in there to knock down frag, to get in there, were really important. And then some of the other considerations that we've had for these projects are what's our impact? A lot of the time, is the cure worse than the disease? So we're treating these vast areas of frag, but how many times are we accessing these sites? What's left over? Is it better, like Janice said, to leave some of the patches there so you have places for animals to hide, for them to use? What's it going to look like? So one of the things that we did differently with some of our projects, because we did want to burn eventually, is we left all of our frags standing. It remains standing in Rondo. We haven't got the conditions to do any burning there. And we've sort of just let it kind of disintegrate naturally. It's protected the shoreline a bit there. I know at Long Point some of it got knocked down, rolled down, so it was exposed to wave energy and things like that. But Rondo, it's still standing. Most of it's sort of disintegrated away, but it kind of it protected what's left there of the shoreline.
Kind of some of you going to finish up?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. Just kind of some of the perpetual things that we keep coming back to. A lot of the sites that we showed today are spots that we've gone back to 2 or 3 times now since we started treating frag. Need for retreatments and touch up, need to stay on it. Need to think about sources of seed, upwind and upstream. The weather plays a huge factor in a lot of levels. In terms of spraying, there's wind and precipitation to consider. That also comes into play for burning. And with that high complexity burn, I talk about we won the weather lottery. We had extremely cold temperatures where everything was frozen. We could drive on it to flatten it, roll it down, and we didn't get any snow for a week. That allowed us to burn that 100 hectares. To try and get that weather in Southern Ontario is the lottery. And then building off Janice's presentation, the new technology, drone allowing for access with some limits, but allowing us to get into places we couldn't before, and the future, if there's any biocontrol future. Still lots more work to do, and kind of building off Curtis's discussion about what's going on with your neighbors. There's 3 or 4 tributaries just in my town across the bay, completely full of frag that are constantly draining into the bay and over to the park. And the picture on the bottom right is a giant island of frag that broke loose from the south end of the bay and migrated its way up to the north end of the bay. So it's not going away anytime soon.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jenny and John, for that great presentation. It's amazing to see the work over the last 20 years and how it's evolved over time and all the learnings that have come from that, because I know that supported a lot of the other work that's gone on in Ontario and other places. So thank you both for that presentation. We're going to move into a short break here. We'll be coming back around 2:20, so about 5 minutes for a quick stretch break. Yeah, next up is our research session, but we'll see you there at 2:20. Thanks, everyone.